My wife, Sarah, was a high school math teacher. She had always been passionate about her work, the kind of person who could make algebra and geometry seem almost magical to her students. When we first met, it was her intelligence and enthusiasm that drew me in. She had this way of lighting up a room when she talked about her students or some new creative method she was using to teach equations. We met in college, both of us in our early 20s, and it wasn't long before we started dating. I was drawn to her confidence, her quick wit, and the way she seemed to care so deeply about everything she did. I was studying engineering at the time, and Sarah joked that I must have been a sucker for numbers since I'd fallen for a math nerd like her. We bonded over late-night study sessions, cheap takeout, and dreams of building a future together. After graduation, we got married in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. I landed a job in construction project management, and Sarah started teaching at the local high school. Life wasn't always perfect, but it was good. We bought a modest home, decorated it with care, and even got a dog, Max, who quickly became part of our little family. For years, I thought we had something solid, something that would last. But as the years went by, small cracks began to appear. We'd been married for about 8 years when Sarah made that joke at a casual evening gathering with some friends. It was the kind of night where everyone was letting loose, sharing stories, and laughing over glasses of wine. I remember standing in the corner, feeling proud as Sarah held court with her charm and humor. She always had a knack for being the center of attention without trying too hard. That's when she made the joke. Someone in the group brought up the topic of infidelity, how it seemed to be everywhere these days. Sarah laughed and said, "Well, I'm sure my husband would never find out if I cheated. I'm too clever for him to catch me." The words were followed by a wave of laughter from the group, and even I chuckled at first. But there was something in her tone that felt off. Her laugh didn't quite match her expression, and the way she glanced at me after saying it lingered in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder, was there some truth hidden in her words, or was it just a harmless joke? At the time, I brushed it off, telling myself not to overthink it. But later that night, the memory of her words replayed in my mind like a broken record. When we got home, Sarah seemed oblivious to my unease. I tried to act normal, but the tension between us was palpable. Usually, we'd wind down together, chatting about our day or sharing a quiet moment on the couch. That night, she seemed distracted, retreating to her phone while I sat alone with my thoughts. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Sarah's laugh, her sudden withdrawal, the way she seemed to avoid my gaze, it all added up to a quiet alarm sounding in the back of my mind. At the time, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just reading too much into a silly comment. After all, Sarah had always been honest and dependable. She loved her job, her students, and, at least I thought, me. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment when things started to unravel. That joke wasn't just a harmless quip. It was a crack in the foundation of our relationship, one that I had ignored because I didn't want to believe it could mean anything more. I should have trusted my gut, but instead, I chose to bury my doubts and hope they would fade away. Sarah and I have 2 children. Our daughter Emily, who is 10, and our son Jack, who is 8. They are at that perfect age where they still thought their parents were the coolest people in the world. Emily had inherited Sarah's love of math, while Jack was more into sports. Sarah was always so proud of Emily's curiosity, often helping her with homework long after dinner was over. I used to sit back and watch them at the kitchen table, smiling to myself, thinking how lucky I was to have a wife who was so involved in our kids' lives. That's why it was so hard to notice the changes at first. It wasn't like Sarah suddenly became distant overnight. It happened gradually, so slowly that I convinced myself I was imagining it. It started with Sarah staying late at school more often. She told me she was offering extra lessons to struggling students, which made sense. She'd always been the type of teacher to go the extra mile. Emily would sometimes tag along, doing her own homework in the back of Sarah's classroom while Sarah tutored. I thought nothing of it, until Sarah started coming home long after Emily had been dropped off by a friend's parent. "There was just so much to grade," she'd say, dropping her bag by the door with a sigh. "It's exhausting." I didn't question it. Why would I? She was a dedicated teacher, and if staying late helped her students, I supported it. But the late nights became more frequent. I'd come home from work to find the kids already in their pajamas, asking when Mom would be back. She'd always text or call, apologizing, telling me not to wait up. At first, I didn't think much of it, until the text from her students started. Sarah used to gripe about her students' obsession with their phones. They never put them down, she'd say, rolling her eyes. So when I saw messages popping up on her phone late at night, I assumed they were innocent. Maybe a student needed clarification on a problem, or a parent had a question. But something felt off. The messages weren't from parents. They were from her students. And not the group chat kind asking about homework. They were individual messages. Some were brief, asking if she was available for a lesson. Others were more personal, filled with emojis and the kind of casual tone teenagers use when talking to friends. One night, I noticed a message come through around 11 p.m. Sarah had left her phone charging in the kitchen, and I happened to glance at the screen. "Hey, Mrs. T, are you up?" I stared at the message longer than I should have. Why was a student texting her that late? I didn't say anything right away. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe the kid needed help with a project. I wasn't the kind of husband to snoop, but that one text planted a seed of doubt I couldn't shake. Then came the night Sarah didn't come home until after midnight. She told me earlier in the day that she had back-to-back tutoring sessions after school. Emily had stayed with a friend for dinner, and Jack and I spent the evening playing video games. Around 9, I texted Sarah, asking how things were going. No response. By 10, I tried calling. Straight to voicemail. I stayed up, pacing the living room, phone in hand, until the sound of her car pulling into the driveway jolted me out of my thoughts. The clock read 12:34 a.m. When she walked in, I expected her to look flustered, maybe a little guilty for not texting. But she seemed calm. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," she said, pulling off her shoes. "Sorry, my phone died." I glanced at her bag. The charger was right there, sticking out of the front pocket. "Really?" I replied, crossing my arms. "You charged it before you left this afternoon?" She blinked at me, clearly caught off guard. "Oh, I must have forgotten to plug it in." She brushed past me, heading for the stairs. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was being paranoid, overthinking things. But the late nights, the secretive texts, and the way she avoided eye contact were starting to add up. Over the next week, I began paying closer attention. Sarah's explanations for staying late started to feel rehearsed. Some nights she claimed she had parent-teacher meetings, but when I called the school once to ask about picking up Emily early, the receptionist told me there were no meetings scheduled that week. It wasn't just the late nights. Sarah's mood had shifted, too. She seemed distant at home, distracted even when she was physically there. When I tried to kiss her, she'd pull away subtly, just enough to make it seem like she didn't mean to. I felt like I was losing her, and the worst part was, I didn't know why. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. "Sarah," I started carefully, "is everything okay between us?" She looked up from her laptop, a flash of surprise crossing her face. "Of course. Why would you ask that?" I shrugged, trying to act casual. "You've just been different lately. I feel like we haven't really connected." She sighed, closing her laptop with a soft thud. "Work has been stressful. Some of these kids are going through a lot, and I guess I'm trying to be there for them." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the way she said it, the way she avoided looking at me when she spoke, made me think there was more to the story. That night, as I lay awake, I decided I needed to know the truth. And part of me was terrified of what I might find. It was late September when Sarah told me she had signed up for an advanced teaching course, some kind of professional development for math educators. She said it was an opportunity to stay ahead in her field, something the school had recommended. "It's just a few weekends over the next couple of months," she explained casually over dinner. "Some evening seminars, too." I figured it would be good for my resume. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Sarah had always been driven when it came to her career. She loved teaching, and the idea that she wanted to grow professionally made sense. "Sounds like a great idea," I said, scooping more mashed potatoes onto Jack's plate. Emily, ever the curious one, perked up. Are you going to be gone for a long time, Mom? Sarah smiled, reaching across the table to brush Emily's hair behind her ear. Just a few weekends, sweetie. I'll be home for bedtime. But those weekends added up quickly. At first, Sarah left Saturday mornings and returned home by early evening. But as time went on, her absences stretched longer. Some nights, she wouldn't come back until after the kids had gone to bed. There were even weekends when she claimed the seminars required overnight stays. It's just easier, she said when I asked about it. Driving back and forth wastes too much time. I didn't argue. I trusted her. Or at least, I thought I did. But then her phone started buzzing. Constantly. It wasn't unusual for Sarah's phone to chime with emails or messages from her coworkers. But this felt different. Her phone would vibrate late at night, sometimes long after we'd gone to bed. She kept it close to her, face down on the nightstand. One night, around midnight, I heard the faint hum of her phone vibrating on silent. Sarah had fallen asleep with her back to me, but I could see the faint glow from the screen reflecting on the wall. I reached over carefully, lifting the phone just enough to glance at the screen. A string of messages filled the notification bar, most of them from a single contact labeled LB. I frowned. Can we meet tomorrow? I think I get it now, but I want to make sure. You're the best, Mrs. T, smiling face with smiling eyes. The messages continued, flooding in one after another. Whoever LB was, they weren't holding back. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the screen, listening to Sarah's soft breathing beside me. A student. That's what I told myself. It had to be a student. But why was a student texting her this late? And why hadn't Sarah mentioned anything about tutoring after school hours? The next morning over coffee, I decided to bring it up. Who's LB? I asked, keeping my tone light. Sarah, halfway through buttering a piece of toast, hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Oh, she said, forcing a quick smile. That's Logan, one of my students. He's struggling with calculus. Struggling enough to text you after midnight? Sarah set down the knife and brushed crumbs from her lap. I told him he could reach out if he needed help. Some of these kids have no one at home to turn to. I didn't think you'd mind. I nodded slowly, but something about the way she said it didn't sit right. That afternoon, while Sarah was at school, I found myself staring at the family computer. I knew it was wrong, but curiosity, or maybe it was doubt, got the better of me. I logged into our shared phone account. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for, but I needed some reassurance that nothing was going on. When I opened the call logs, my stomach dropped. Logan wasn't just texting her. He was calling her. Frequently. The call history showed dozens of late-night calls, some lasting over an hour. The longest one stretched past 2 in the morning. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my hands over my face. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Sarah really was just trying to help a struggling student. Maybe Logan didn't have anyone else. But deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, I watched Sarah more closely. She was spending more time on her phone, slipping away into the other room when she thought I wasn't paying attention. When I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly one evening, she quickly lowered her phone, the screen still glowing in her lap. Everything okay? I asked casually, pretending not to notice. Yeah, she replied, far too quickly. Just finalizing some lesson plans. But her face was flushed, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. I decided I needed to know for sure. A week later, Sarah packed her overnight bag for another training seminar. She kissed the kids goodbye, promising to bring them something back from the trip, and left in her usual rush. But this time, I followed her. I waited 10 minutes before getting in my car, keeping enough distance between us so she wouldn't notice. She drove past the school, past the district office, and right into the parking lot of a rundown apartment complex across town. Watched as Sarah sat behind the wheel, checking her phone. She was waiting for someone. A few minutes later, the door to one of the ground-level apartments swung open. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate and relaxed, like someone who wasn't in a rush. He had a shaved head, tattoos creeping up his neck, and a presence that seemed to carry weight with every step. He was older, mid-40s, maybe 50. He looked nothing like a student. Sarah got out of the car, smoothing her jacket as she walked toward him. The man greeted her with a nod, stepping aside to let her into the apartment. As she passed by him, she placed a hand on his arm briefly, an intimate gesture, the kind you don't make with someone you barely know. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. This wasn't a struggling student. This wasn't a tutoring session. I watched the apartment door close behind them, and the sinking feeling in my stomach became undeniable. That night, Sarah came home just after 11 p.m. The kids were already in bed, and I sat at the kitchen table with the lights dimmed, waiting. When she walked in, she gave me that tired, rehearsed smile. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She sighed, dropping her bag by the door. "Yeah, these seminars are draining, but it's worth it." She opened the fridge and pulled out a bottle of water, taking a long sip. I watched her carefully. "How was the drive?" I asked. "Oh, not too bad. Traffic was light." I nodded slowly. Funny, considering she hadn't driven more than 15 miles from home. I let the silence stretch out, waiting to see if she'd say more. She didn't. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You know," I said casually, "I was in the area today. Thought I might swing by, maybe take you out to lunch between sessions." Sarah froze, water bottle halfway to her lips. "Oh," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "I wish you had told me. We had back-to-back lectures." "Really?" I asked, tilting my head, because I didn't see a conference center. Just an old apartment complex off of 3rd Street. Her grip on the bottle tightened, and she slowly set it down on the counter. "Why were you there?" she asked, carefully avoiding eye contact. "I could ask you the same thing." For a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if weighing whether to try and walk away from this conversation. "Look," she finally said, crossing her arms defensively. "I didn't think I needed to explain every second of my day. Sometimes I need space, too. I was just helping someone out." I leaned back in the chair, arms crossed over my chest. "Helping out?" I echoed. "Who exactly were you helping?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. He's the father of one of my students. He's been struggling to find work, and I've been trying to help him get his life back together." My stomach twisted. "And that requires late-night visits?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Don't start with the accusations. You don't know what it's like to see these kids come from broken homes. Sometimes the parents need just as much support as the students." I stared at her, waiting for the truth, the real truth. "Who is he, Sarah?" She exhaled heavily, finally sitting across from me. "His name is Rick," she said quietly. "His son Logan is in my class. Rick, he's been through a lot. He got out of prison last year and is trying to rebuild his life. I've been tutoring Logan for months, and Rick, he needed someone to talk to." The pieces started falling into place. Rick, Logan's father. The messages from LB weren't from Logan at all. They were from his dad. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "And you've been seeing him, outside of school," I pressed, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "It's not like that," she insisted, but the way she said it felt hollow, rehearsed. "I was just trying to help. I didn't think it would be an issue." I sat in silence, staring at the woman I thought I knew. Maybe she really did think she was helping him at first, but somewhere along the way, the lines blurred. And now, here we were. "Is there something going on between you two?" I finally asked. Her eyes flickered to the side, and for the briefest second, I saw the hesitation, the crack in her armor. "I don't know," she whispered. That answer hit harder than if she'd just said yes. That night, as Sarah slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I could hear the soft hum of her phone vibrating once again on the nightstand. I didn't need to look. I already knew who it was. And for the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel like I was lying next to my wife. I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. The truth unraveled faster than I could brace for it. Sarah's confession came like a slow, unraveling thread, one she couldn't stop even if she wanted to. She admitted the affair wasn't with a struggling father or a distant colleague, but with Daniel, the older brother of one of her students. Daniel was an ex-con, freshly out of prison, and had been staying with his family temporarily. Sarah's reason was simple yet brutal. Daniel made her feel something she hadn't felt in years: passion. He was assertive in ways I wasn't, intense in a way that reminded her she was still desirable. The quiet routines of our marriage had dulled that spark for her, and Daniel became a quick fix for the emptiness she didn't even know she had been harboring. Hearing those words felt like being gutted. The very core of my marriage, the comfort, the trust, had been repainted as complacency in her eyes. What I thought was stability had been suffocating for her. And Daniel, with his rough edges and dark past, represented the opposite of everything I had provided. It was during one of her late-night training sessions that things between them escalated. Sarah had met him through his younger brother, Logan, one of her students who frequently stayed after school for help. Daniel would sometimes pick Logan up, waiting by Sarah's car in the parking lot. The casual interactions between them evolved quickly, and Sarah found herself seeking out reasons to linger just a little longer. Their affair became a tangled web of secrets, wrapped in excuses and lies. Sarah justified the time she spent away from home by telling herself she was offering support to a struggling family. The reality was far less noble. She was visiting Daniel in his brother's apartment, slipping away under the pretense of professional development, while the rest of us, her family, sat at home believing the lie. The kids, of course, were far from oblivious. Emily, sharp-eyed and curious as ever, had overheard Sarah on the phone one evening. It wasn't clear how much she understood at the time, but the words had stuck with her. Jack, though younger, could sense the tension that had been brewing in the house. Children may not understand the intricacies of betrayal, but they can read the shifts in the air when something is wrong. The following morning, Sarah's nervousness lingered over breakfast. Emily sat quietly, eyes flickering towards Sarah but saying nothing. Jack remained glued to the TV, but he occasionally cast sideways glances in my direction. The weight of unspoken words hung over the kitchen table, and it was clear the kids knew something wasn't right. Later that day, while I sorted through bills in the living room, Emily approached cautiously. She stood at the edge of the couch, hesitating before finally asking why her mom had been acting strange. There was no easy way to explain it without unraveling the thin threads holding everything together. I tried to mask the truth with vague reassurances, but Emily wasn't convinced. The cracks widened later that night. As Sarah tucked the kids into bed, Emily asked directly if Sarah had cheated. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Jack, curious but uncertain, looked to Sarah for an answer she couldn't provide. Sarah's face paled as she scrambled for the right words, but the weight of the truth was already pressing down on all of us. By the next day, the children's behavior shifted. Emily kept her distance from Sarah, treating her with polite coldness, still respectful, but distant in a way that wasn't natural for a 10-year-old. Jack mirrored his sister, sensing that something fragile had been broken. The once warm hugs Sarah used to receive after work were replaced by brief, stiff interactions. Sarah's attempts to bridge the gap felt desperate. She tried to overcompensate, offering to take them out for ice cream, planning movie nights, but none of it had the same effect. The kids could feel the shift in the atmosphere, and no amount of cheerful distractions could mask the undercurrent of tension rippling through the house. In the following weeks, the weight of Sarah's confession permeated everything. The kids' questions became more pointed, though they never outright disrespected their mother. Emily, in particular, grew protective of me in subtle ways, sitting closer to me at dinner or spending extra time helping with household chores she previously avoided. The fracture in our family was undeniable, and while Sarah tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the truth had planted itself firmly in our household. It was a shadow that stretched over everything, and there was no escaping the fact that our marriage and our family had fundamentally changed. The house felt heavier after the truth surfaced, as if the weight of Sarah's betrayal had settled into the walls. I found myself retreating from her more and more, spending evenings with the kids while Sarah lingered in other rooms, avoiding the awkward silence that stretched between us. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone at the dining table, staring at nothing in particular. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something we could patch over with apologies and promises to do better. The fracture was too deep. I decided I needed space. More than that, I needed time away. The following weekend, I packed a bag for myself and the kids. Sarah watched from the kitchen doorway as I loaded the car, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She hadn't said much since I brought up the trip the night before. There was no pleading or apology, just quiet disapproval that simmered beneath the surface. When I told her I needed time to think, she scoffed and turned away, as if the entire situation was more of an inconvenience than a collapse of our marriage. "I'm not the only one to blame here," she said as I zipped up the last bag. Her voice was calm, controlled, like she'd rehearsed this. "You haven't exactly been warm lately. It's not like I cheated because I wanted to hurt you. I needed more. You never seemed to notice how distant you'd become." I let her words hang there, refusing to dignify them with a response. As I pulled out of the driveway with the kids in the back seat, Sarah stood by the front door, watching us leave with the same unreadable expression. The drive to my parents' cabin was long, but it felt necessary. Emily and Jack stayed quiet during the ride, feeling the weight of the trip. I tried to keep the mood light, pointing out trees, playing road trip games, but the tension lingered just below the surface. We spent the next week at the cabin, fishing in the mornings and sitting by the fire at night. Emily warmed up after a few days, laughing more freely, while Jack took to skipping rocks by the lake. Being away from home was like taking a breath after holding it for far too long. I spent the quiet hours of the night replaying everything in my head. The betrayal, the excuses, the constant shifting of blame. Sarah never once acknowledged the damage she had done. Instead, she buried it under the same tired arguments, that I had grown cold, that I had somehow driven her to this. By the third night at the cabin, I realized I wasn't coming back to fix anything. I wasn't sure when I made the decision, but by then, it felt solid. Divorce was inevitable. I couldn't keep pretending that Sarah's betrayal was something we could overcome. The day before I planned to return home, I received a call from Sarah. I stepped outside, pacing near the lake as I answered. Her voice was shaky, laced with frustration and something else, fear. "Daniel robbed me," she said, almost in disbelief. I didn't say anything. I waited for her to continue. She explained how Daniel had convinced her to lend him money, promising it was for something temporary, a quick fix until he got back on his feet. But it wasn't just money. Jewelry was missing from the house. A few pieces of gold I'd given her over the years, along with some cash she had been keeping aside for a vacation fund. It wasn't hard to piece together the rest. Daniel hadn't changed after prison. The same recklessness that landed him behind bars the first time still coursed through him. And Sarah, blinded by whatever excitement he brought into her life, had been his perfect mark. She asked if I could come back early, as if I could swoop in and help her clean up the mess. I told her no. I wasn't coming back to patch up the life she had torn apart. When I finally returned home with the kids, Sarah was different. She greeted Emily and Jack with hugs, but there was something hollow in her eyes, like the reality of her decisions had finally begun to settle in. Later that night, she tried to bring it up again. This time, there was no defensiveness, just exhaustion. She admitted that Daniel had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and the mess he'd made of her life. But even in her regret, there was no apology for what she had done to me. The blame still hovered in the air, unspoken but present. I started the divorce process the next day. Filing for divorce felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. The moment I returned from the cabin, I contacted a lawyer. I sat across from him in his office, a sterile room lined with shelves of legal books and certificates, and laid it all out, the affair, the lies, and the robbery. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told him exactly what I wanted. "I want full custody of the kids," I said, my voice steady. "And I want her to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back." The lawyer nodded slowly, tapping his pen against his notepad. He had seen it before. Men coming into his office, hollow-eyed and angry, ready to burn everything down after betrayal. But this wasn't just anger. It was resolved. I wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. I simply couldn't let Sarah take any more from me, especially not Emily and Jack. Sarah had chosen her path, and now I was choosing mine. The papers were served 3 days later. Sarah barely reacted when I handed them to her. She sat at the kitchen table, skimming over the neatly printed lines of legal jargon, but she hardly read them. She already knew what was coming. "I figured this was where we were headed," she muttered, setting the papers aside. She didn't cry, and she didn't argue. She accepted it with a strange sense of detachment, as if the life we had built together was already behind her. 2 days later, she packed her things and left the house. The kids and I stood in the living room as she hugged them goodbye, promising that they'd see her soon. Jack clung to her for a moment, confused and reluctant, but Emily held back. She was polite but distant, offering a quick hug before stepping aside. Sarah moved in with her parents, an arrangement that carried its own weight of irony. Her parents had never been fond of me, and they didn't hide it well. In their eyes, I was the dull, safe husband who couldn't keep their daughter entertained. I could only imagine the conversations happening in their house now, with Sarah returning home under a cloud of humiliation. But none of that mattered. Let them whisper. Let them blame me if it made them feel better. I had my kids, and I wasn't about to let them go. The court battle was brief but brutal. Sarah's lawyer attempted to argue for shared custody, painting her as a devoted mother who had simply made a mistake. They leaned heavily into the narrative that divorces were messy, but ultimately needed to prioritize co-parenting. My lawyer tore that apart piece by piece. There were no glowing testimonials or character witnesses for Sarah. I had evidence: the affair, the missing money, and Daniel's criminal record. The robbery alone cast Sarah in a deeply unfavorable light. Any judge looking at the situation could see it. She had compromised the stability of our home for the sake of her fling with a man fresh out of prison. Daniel hadn't stayed free for long. Not even 2 months after robbing Sarah, he was arrested in connection with another burglary. This time, he wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. When that news broke, Sarah didn't even try to defend him. She stopped answering his calls and quietly erased his number from her phone. The day of the final custody hearing, Sarah barely met my eyes. The judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody with Sarah limited to supervised visitation every other weekend. As we left the courthouse, Sarah lingered near the steps, watching as I walked to the car with Emily and Jack. I could feel her gaze on me, but I didn't look back. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Back at home, the silence felt different. The house no longer carried the weight of secrets and tension. It was just me and the kids, trying to piece things back together. Emily adjusted quickly, filling her afternoons with school and friends, but Jack struggled at first. He missed Sarah in the quiet moments, asking about her before bed or during breakfast. I didn't have the heart to speak poorly of her to them. As much as I wanted to explain the truth in its rawest form, I couldn't. She was still their mother. And while I couldn't shield them from everything, I could at least soften the edges. "She loves you," I told them one evening as we sat around the dinner table. "She just made some mistakes. We all do." Jack nodded quietly, but Emily, wise beyond her years, simply watched me, as if she already understood the parts one wasn't saying. Sarah's absence became part of the rhythm of our lives. I heard less and less from her as the months passed. Her calls to the kids grew sporadic, and eventually, they stopped asking when she would visit. The divorce settlement left Sarah with little. Most of what we had built together remained with me. Her parents took her in, but she drifted further from all of us, like someone walking backwards into the fog. I wasn't angry anymore. There was no satisfaction in watching her life unravel, just a quiet sense of closure. I had survived the storm. Now, I was just grateful to stand on the other side of it, holding my kids' hands as we stepped into whatever came next. In the rare quiet moments, when the kids were asleep, I often found myself thinking back to how it all started. The red flags had been there from the beginning, subtle but persistent. The late nights at school, the unexplained absences, the growing distance between us. At the time, I had brushed them off, telling myself I was overthinking things. Sarah had always been so good at explaining things away, wrapping her excuses in just enough truth to make them believable. But looking back, I could see it clearly. The shift wasn't sudden. It had crept in slowly, like a crack in the foundation that eventually grew too large to ignore. Sarah's withdrawal hadn't started with Daniel. It had begun long before that, in the small, quiet moments where our connection faded. I thought about the time she pulled away when I reached for her hand, or the way she always seemed to be somewhere else, even when she was sitting right beside me. I had ignored it, convincing myself that marriages went through phases, that we'd bounce back eventually. But in doing so, I had allowed the distance to grow. I wasn't blaming myself for her affair. That weight was hers to carry, but I couldn't deny the parts of our marriage that I had let slip away. I decided I wasn't going to let that happen again. I threw myself into rebuilding, not just for the kids, but for myself. I started hitting the gym again, something I hadn't done regularly since the early years of our marriage. At first, it felt strange, standing in front of the mirror, lifting weights, trying to remember the routines I used to know by heart. But as the weeks passed, the soreness faded, and a quiet sense of strength started to return. I also began reconnecting with old friends, the ones I had drifted away from during the marriage. We met for beers after work, played poker on the weekends, and even planned a camping trip with the kids. Surrounding myself with familiar faces reminded me of who I had been before the weight of everything pulled me down. Most importantly, I stopped blaming myself. There were nights when the doubts crept in, whispering that maybe if I had been different, more attentive, more exciting, Sarah wouldn't have strayed. But those thoughts never lingered long. I had given everything I could to that marriage, and in the end, it wasn't enough because Sarah hadn't wanted it to be. I refused to carry the burden of her choices any longer. As the months passed, the house slowly began to feel like a home again. I redecorated the living room, painting over the walls Sarah had chosen, replacing old furniture with things the kids and I picked out together. Emily chose the color for her new room, lavender, her favorite, and Jack covered his walls with posters of superheroes and dinosaurs. We carved out new routines, new traditions. Sunday mornings became pancake breakfasts. Friday nights were for camping in the backyard or staying up late with board games. Bit by bit, life felt like it was moving forward. One evening, as I tucked Jack into bed, he asked if Sarah was going to move back in someday. I knelt beside him, brushing his hair from his forehead. I told him the truth, carefully choosing my words. Sarah wasn't coming back, not in the way he might have hoped. But I reassured him that both of his parents loved him, even if we weren't living under the same roof anymore. Jack seemed to accept that answer, curling under his blanket and drifting to sleep. Emily, overhearing from the hallway, lingered near the door. She didn't ask the same questions. I think she already knew the answers. By the time the first anniversary of the divorce came around, I felt lighter. The anger that once sat heavy in my chest had softened, and I began to see the entire experience as something else, a lesson. I hadn't just survived Sarah's betrayal. I had grown stronger because of it. I no longer second-guessed my instincts. I paid attention to the people around me, recognizing the subtle ways that relationships shift and change. And most importantly, I learned to trust myself again. The life I had built with Sarah was gone, but the life I was building now, piece by piece, felt more solid than anything we ever had. I'm not here to tell you I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. There were moments when I let anger get the best of me, and times I held on longer than I should have, hoping for change that was never coming. But I made it through, and that counts for something. So here's what I've learned, laid out plainly. Trust your gut. It's rarely wrong. Looking back, the signs were there long before the affair began. The distance, the excuses, the small shifts in behavior that didn't seem like much at the time. They were all pieces of a bigger picture I didn't want to see. If you feel like something isn't right, don't ignore it. It's not paranoia. It's your instincts trying to protect you. People show you who they are, believe them. Sarah wasn't a bad person, but she made selfish choices that destroyed our marriage. If someone shows you through their choices that they don't value your relationship, believe them. Don't explain away red flags because you're afraid of losing them. Protect yourself and your children. When everything started falling apart, my first instinct was to shield my kids from it. I didn't want them to know the details, and I tried to keep the peace. But kids are smarter than we give them credit for. They pick up on the tension, the silence, and the things left unsaid. Be honest with them in an age-appropriate way. Show them that even when life doesn't go as planned, stability and love can still exist. You don't owe anyone endless chances. One of the hardest pills to swallow was realizing that love alone isn't enough to keep someone faithful or committed. You can't save a relationship by yourself. If the other person isn't willing to meet you halfway, don't set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Walk away with your dignity intact. You're stronger than you think. I didn't think I'd make it through those first few months after Sarah left. But here I am. I built something better, something stronger. Not because I never stumbled, but because I kept going. What's the biggest red flag you ignored in a relationship? Do you think people can truly change? Or do patterns always repeat? If you have kids, how did you? Or how would you explain a breakup or divorce to them? How much do you think children should know about their parents' problems?